There is a version of Ringo Starr that the world decided to believe in. The lovable one. The lucky one. The Beatle who smiled through everything, who made peace with being called the least talented member of the most famous band in history, who laughed off every insult and emerged on the other side of the storm without a single visible scar. That version of Ringo is real, in part. He did survive. He did smile. He did make peace with much of what happened during those extraordinary, turbulent years. But surviving is not the same as forgetting. And making peace is not the same as forgiving. Because beneath the peace sign tattoos and the rings stacked on every finger, beneath the cheerful public persona that Ringo Starr built so carefully over 6 decades, there was a wound that never properly healed. A wound caused not by a stranger, not by a critic, not by the press that mocked him from the beginning, but by someone who entered his life as a savior and left it as a destroyer. To understand why this particular man earned a permanent place in the darkest corner of Ringo's heart, you have to understand where Ringo came from, what he had already survived before the Beatles, and what the Beatles ultimately meant to him beyond music and fame. Richard Starkey was born in 1940 in the Dingle, one of the toughest neighborhoods in Liverpool. His childhood was not shaped by music or ambition or rock and roll dreams. It was shaped by hospitals. At the age of 6, a burst appendix triggered peritonitis, a life-threatening infection that kept him bedridden and out of school for an entire year. Just as he was beginning to catch up, tuberculosis arrived at 13 and took 2 more years of his life, this time inside a sanatorium where time moved slowly and the outside world felt impossibly distant. By the time he was a teenager, Ringo Starkey was behind his peers in almost every measurable way. Academically, socially, physically. The other boys had continued growing while he lay in hospital beds. They had made friends while he stared at ceilings. They had developed confidence while he developed the particular quietness that comes from spending too much time alone with your own thoughts. It was a quietness that never entirely left him, even when the world placed him on the biggest stages imaginable. What the sanatorium did give him was a drum kit, or rather the beginning of one. The nurses at Heswall Children's Hospital encouraged the patients to make music as a form of therapy, and something about the act of hitting things in rhythm reached Ringo in a way that nothing else had. It was physical, it was immediate, it didn't require the academic skills he had missed, and it produced a result you could feel in your chest. He practiced obsessively. By his late teens, he was good enough to play professionally, and by the early 1960s, he had become one of the most reliable drummers on the Liverpool circuit, anchoring Rory Storm and the Hurricanes with a steady, powerful groove that serious musicians noticed and respected. What he didn't have, and what he felt the absence of constantly, was the assumption that he deserved to be where he was. That insecurity, born in those hospital years, followed him everywhere. When the Beatles invited Ringo to replace Pete Best in August of 1962, the music press decided almost immediately that he was the least qualified person in the room. Headlines called him the luckiest man in music. Critics dismissed him as a timekeeper. The more generous commentators suggested he was adequate. Almost nobody, in those early years, suggested that his drumming was actually doing something remarkable for the songs, that his restraint was a form of genius, that his ability to serve the music without overplaying was precisely what those songs needed. Ringo heard every dismissive word. He collected them the way some people collect compliments, storing them in a part of himself that he rarely showed publicly. And the thing that made it worse was that the dismissal didn't come only from outside the band. Inside the Beatles, the hierarchy was obvious and unspoken. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the architects. George Harrison was the guitarist with something to prove. And Ringo was, in the polite version, the final piece of the puzzle, and in the less polite version, the man who had replaced someone else and should be grateful for the opportunity. He was grateful. That was the painful part. He genuinely was. He understood what joining the Beatles meant in a way that perhaps only someone who had spent years feeling left behind could understand. He didn't take a single day of it for granted. But gratitude and dignity are not the same thing, and Ringo spent a significant portion of his Beatles years feeling that the second one was in short supply. The recording of Love Me Do, one of the band's earliest singles, contained a humiliation that Ringo never entirely got over. Producer George Martin, not yet confident in the new drummer, brought in a session musician named Andy White to play the part instead, relegating Ringo to the tambourine on his own band's record. Martin eventually apologized, and Ringo acknowledged the apology. But the sting of it became a template for every subsequent moment when someone implied that he could be replaced without much being lost. Within the band, the friendships were real and complicated. With John there was admiration and occasional hurt. With Paul there were genuine artistic clashes that sometimes became genuinely painful. With George there was a bond built on shared outsider status, 2 men who understood what it felt like to exist in the shadow of 2 extraordinarily dominant personalities. What Ringo never expected, during all of those years and all of those conflicts, was that the man who would eventually earn a permanent place in his bitterest memories would be someone who arrived after the band was already formed. Someone from outside. Someone who promised to solve problems and instead became the largest problem of all. That man was Alan Klein. Brian Epstein died in August of 1967, and the Beatles lost something irreplaceable. Whatever tensions existed within the band, and there were many, Epstein had provided a stabilizing presence, a manager who genuinely loved the group and kept the more destructive impulses in check. Without him, the business side of the Beatles became a slow-motion disaster. Apple Corps, the company the band had launched with considerable idealism and insufficient organizational skill, was hemorrhaging money. Decisions that should have been straightforward became arguments. Arguments that should have been resolved became lawsuits. The band that had conquered the world was struggling to manage its own affairs. Into this vulnerability walked Alan Klein, an American music industry operator with a reputation for aggressive negotiation and impressive results. He had worked with the Rolling Stones and claimed significant victories on their behalf. He presented himself with tremendous confidence, arriving with numbers and strategies and the kind of forceful certainty that exhausted people find irresistible. John Lennon was the first Beatle to be convinced. George Harrison followed. And Ringo, who by his own later admission was simply tired of the chaos and desperate for someone to impose order on it, went along. He would spend years regretting it. What Klein understood, with a shrewdness that bordered on predatory, was that the Beatles were not a unified group by this point. They were four individuals with different priorities, different insecurities, and different visions of what the band should become. Paul McCartney, characteristically, had his own candidate in mind for management and refused to sign with Klein. That refusal, rather than being treated as a reasonable disagreement among partners, became in Klein's framing a declaration of war. The 3-against-1 dynamic that emerged from Klein's management of the situation was not an accident. It was a strategy. Every meeting became a referendum on Paul. Every decision became an opportunity to deepen the divide. Klein understood that Paul's need for control and John's desire to move in a completely different direction were combustible materials, and he provided the spark whenever it suited his interests. The result was a band that was already struggling to communicate collapsing entirely under the weight of legal disputes and personal betrayals. Ringo had no particular appetite for conflict. Of all the Beatles, he was the one most genuinely committed to keeping the peace, not out of weakness but out of a real understanding of what they had built together and what would be lost if it fell apart. He had come from nothing. He had spent years outside looking in. He knew, in his bones, what it meant to belong to something, and he knew what it would cost to lose it. The Beatles were not just a career for Ringo Starr. They were, in a very real sense, the family he had fought his whole life to find. So when Klein's management led inexorably toward the dissolution of that family, the betrayal was not merely professional. It was personal in the deepest possible way. The lawsuits that followed the band's breakup in 1970 were ugly and prolonged and left wounds in every direction. And Ringo, who had trusted Klein at least in part because he believed it was the only available option for preserving what remained of the group's unity, found himself surveying the wreckage and understanding that the man he had trusted had been, at every step, serving his own interests rather than theirs. The financial irregularities that eventually came to light were significant. Klein was sued by the Beatles for mishandling funds. He was later convicted on tax charges related to his business dealings, a development that confirmed what Ringo had come to believe years earlier. The man had arrived presenting himself as a fixer and had left having broken something that couldn't be repaired. What made it worse, and this is the part that settled most deeply in Ringo's memory, was the timing. Klein had arrived during the most vulnerable period in the Beatles' history. He had seen the fault lines clearly, and rather than helping to bridge them, he had worked those fault lines for his own benefit. You can forgive someone who causes damage accidentally. It is much harder to forgive someone who causes damage deliberately, who studies the people who trust him and finds the precise pressure points that will cause the most harm. There is a story, passed along through people who knew George Harrison in his later years, of a conversation in which George was asked about the possibility of the Beatles ever reuniting. His answer was telling. He said that the only way a reunion could ever happen was if Alan Klein was not part of the picture. George was ready, he said. Ringo was ready. The obstacle was Klein's continued involvement in their affairs and the legal and emotional residue he had left behind. That conversation captures something important about how the surviving Beatles processed the Klein years. It was not ancient history that they had moved past. It was a wound that stayed tender. And for Ringo, who had experienced so many wounds over the course of his career, the Klein wound occupied a category of its own, because it was the wound that ended the story before the story was finished. The Beatles could have survived John's transformation. They had survived it for years already, absorbing the tensions and continuing to make extraordinary music. They could have survived Paul's controlling perfectionism. That tension, too, had been part of the band's creative engine for a long time. They might even have survived the slow drift of George's increasing independence and outside collaborations. These were all real stresses, but they were stresses that bands manage, that families manage, when the external structure holding them together is sound.